Welcome to From Shadows to the Block, a collection where the characters don't just exist. They breathe, they fight, and they survive, if they're lucky. Her Girls Always. A short story by Brian Eldridge Sr. 2026. Essence rolled over and rubbed her itchy eyes. One of the first rays of sun broke through the pink and black polka dot Hello Kitty curtains. She pulled the covers back up over her shoulder, trapping the overnight heat. "Essie," whispered her sister Serenity, her voice scratchy. "You up?" Essence stretched her legs and groaned. "Yeah," she said, her body shaking through the stretch. "You think Mommy will get us a dog?" Essence stiffened. She sat up in her bed and turned to see Serenity sitting on the edge of her twin bed. Her pajama pant leg was hoisted up to her knee. Her braids hung over her shoulders in perfect bundles. "You crazy! You know what she said. No pets!" Essence snapped. Serenity crossed her arms, frustrated, her face scrunched up as she moaned with disappointment. "I really wanted a puppy," she said, pouting. Essence tossed the comforter off, swung her legs off the bed, and crossed the room to join her sister on her bed. Essence leaned over and bumped her shoulder to her younger sister. "TT," Essence started, "you know we get pretty much whatever we want." Serenity tightened her grip on her arms and let out a soft huff. "We had that fish one time. She got rid of it the first day. Then she got rid of the bowl the day after. We didn't even get a chance," she cried. Essence put her arm around her sister and pulled her closer. She leaned her head over, and their hair tangled together in identical obsidian links. "You remember when you told her you wanted a new dress and we had it before you went to bed that night?" "Yes," Serenity said, mumbling under her breath. "And remember when you wanted that new iPhone and you had it the next day and it was in a color that we hadn't even seen before?" "Yeah, Essie. Dang," Serenity said, feeling silly. "My point is that we don't have anything to complain about. Mommy takes good care of us," she said, hopping off the bed and padding over to her dresser. Essence looked at herself in the mirror. She smiled at her perfect teeth and her unbelievably bronzed skin. Her eyes were big and wide, with deep dark centers that went on forever, like the furthest reaches of space. Serenity stood up and slouched over to Essence's dresser and dropped down to a knee beside her big sister. The only person she looked up to more than Essence was her mother. She watched how Essence preened in the mirror and how she would fix her immaculately designed braids each day. She marveled at her creativity with bows and scrunchies, even though she couldn't even remember what she had done with half of them. Serenity, like Essence, had bronze, blemish-free skin. She had a slight gap between her two front teeth, but it wasn't anything she worried about. Nobody at school ever picked on her about it, so it was never a big deal. Even her mother said that the slightest imperfections are part of what made them beautiful. "I wouldn't have you any other way," she remembered her mother saying with a big smile. Serenity's smile crossed her face as she watched her sister tie up her hair into knots. "Can you do mine like that?" Essence was about to answer as a soft knock at the door interrupted. It was their mother, Theresa. Her hair was styled perfectly in a smooth bob with auburn highlights. Her lips bore a large grin, exposing her bright teeth. Her eyes glowed in a light brown, almost yellow hue. "Girls," their mother said softly, "breakfast is ready. Then you gotta get ready for school." Essence turned her beaming smile to her mother and gave her a nod. "Okay, Mommy, we'll be down in a second." Serenity hopped up and bounced with excitement. "Can we have sausage patties instead of links?" Theresa stood for a second too long, staring at Serenity. She blinked a couple of times and answered, Of course," Theresa said, her smile fading briefly before she ambled down the hall and down to the kitchen. Essence whipped her head around to Serenity, and her eyes tightened. She didn't frown, but she wore a serious expression. "You gotta stop asking for stuff. Mommy is doing the best she can. It's too much," Essence said. Serenity crossed her arms again and rolled her neck. "I just asked for sausage patties, not a dog," she said, as she stomped out of the room. Essence looked at herself in the mirror. One of her knots had come undone. Her shoulders slumped for a half-second before she decided to put it back up. Soon after, she joined her mother and sister in the kitchen for breakfast. Serenity was already sitting at the long, dark, woody, rectangular table. The table was draped by a maroon runner with a cream tassel on each end. The heavy chairs felt sturdy enough to hold the weight of the world, not to mention a 75-pound 12-year-old. Theresa stood at the sprawling counter with her back turned to the children. She hummed softly as she made her children's plates. Essence joined Serenity and put her elbows on the table, patiently waiting for her plate. "Elbows off the table, Essie," Theresa said between hums, her back still turned. Essence removed her elbows and put her hands into her lap. She inhaled the aroma of the sage and peppers in the sausage. Her mouth was wet with anticipation. Essence watched Theresa turn with 2 plates before giving a quick glance at Serenity, surveying the happy grin on her face. She turned back to her mother and noticed Theresa had her back turned again. Her mother turned again with the plates and served them to the girls. "Thank you, Mommy," Serenity said, jabbing her fork through the sausage patty. Theresa gave a nod, and a smile appeared on her face briefly before she looked at Essence, who had a scoop of eggs headed towards her mouth. "It's good, Mommy. Thank you," Essence said. Theresa smiled warmly and ran her fingers through her hair. Essence lifted her eyes and noticed her mother running her fingers through her hair. Theresa was 35 years old, and she didn't look a day over 30. Essence and Serenity admired their mother's beauty, but not nearly as much as they admired her warmth and kindness. Serenity often wondered what happened to their father, but Essence never did. She never felt the need. Their mother was everything they needed, the example of prime womanhood. Everything from the way she looked to the way she mothered them and the way she provided for them. They never had to worry because Theresa was omnipresent in their lives. She was there with breakfast in the morning. She got them off to school. She was there in the evenings, and she turned off the lights at night when it was time to sleep. "Finish up, girls. It's time for school." Serenity nodded and took a gulp of her orange juice. Essence, still watching her mother absent-mindedly run her fingers through her hair, noticed a single strand of gray vibrating from the black and deep auburn shades. Essence couldn't stop staring. She had never seen a gray hair in her mother's crown. "Essie, school, honey," she said, feeling suddenly self-conscious and smoothing her hair again. Essence got up silently, put down her fork, and hustled to her bedroom. Once she was dressed, she grabbed her heavy leather satchel and scooted downstairs to the front door, joining Serenity. Serenity, as usual, was bouncing in place, anticipating whatever came next. Essence looked at her little sister with a curious smile, the way her braid caught in the air, almost in slow motion, before dropping back to her shoulders. She gasped as she felt Theresa's warm hand on her shoulder. Essence didn't hear her mother come up from behind her. "Let's go," she whispered. The 3 left the foyer, and the door clicked behind them. At school, Essence sat in class, her book spread wide in front of her. She wasn't fond of pre-algebra, but since she aced all of her classes, she always wound up in advanced placement courses. Math, science, English, history. It was all easy. It was almost like she had the kind of memory that never faltered, except for the small details. She rubbed her satchel on the back of her desk chair. The leather was soft to the touch. The threading was tight. Even with her back turned, she could still smell the bitter scent permeating her space. The memory of the satchel seemed to just be there. No real explanation of when she got it or where her mom found it. She just knew it was hers, and she loved it. Essence continued to rub the strap until she looked outside. It was so still. There were no cars or buses out front. She did see a house across the street. She squinted hard and leaned in a bit and saw her mother sitting on the porch. Essence gasped as she saw her mother smile and wave at her. She sheepishly waved back, completely incredulous. In Serenity's class, she looked around the room full of children. She saw the backs of their heads completely focused on the whiteboard ahead. The big, round clock on the walls ticking was loud enough to register, but not loud enough to disrupt. She tapped her pencil on her lip before looking down at her U.S. history book. She noticed that the other kids had their books opened. She looked across to the girl sitting to her left, but she couldn't make out which page she was on. The boy to the right looked to be on page 214. She quickly thumbed through the pages to match her classmates. When she reached the page, she stopped and stared. The clock ticked, a little louder than before. The page was blank. She inhaled a short, sharp breath and leaned back. She turned back to her classmate on the right, but she couldn't make out what was on the page. The teacher was speaking, but it was nondescript gibberish. Serenity felt like she was in class with Charlie Brown, but the incessant nasally sound emanating from her instructor was unnerving. She began breathing rapidly, her heart pounding. Her pencil snapped in half in her hand as she pressed her palms to the cold desktop. Her eyes closed, and the foreign sounds of her teacher's voice began to ricochet through her mind. Her eyes popped wide open, and she looked down at the blank pages of the book. The bright whiteness of it all was overwhelming. Her mouth opened wide to take in a deep breath, but it was like she was in a vacuum. Oxygen wasn't moving. Panic set in as her fingers tingled and her shoulders stiffened. The ticking of the clock banged like a reverberating bass drum. She wanted to scream out and interrupt all of the students around her, quietly learning and taking in the inane knowledge of the teacher. She wanted to ask for help. Instead, only one word came out in a strained, scratchy whisper. "Mommy." One last tick of the clock, but this time it was soothing. It felt like warm lotion moisturizing her body after a hot shower. When Serenity blinked, she was sitting on the couch in the living room with Essence. Her heart wasn't pounding anymore, and her breathing was surprisingly clear. She turned towards the kitchen, and the aroma of a hearty meal filled the air. She put her hand on her stomach as a soft rumble grinded from her abdomen. "I love this part," Essie said, turning up the volume of the TV. Serenity leaned back, allowing her body to relax. She also loved this part of the movie. Ricky Baker stood on the stage, holding his high school diploma. His big white smile contrasted with his deep, dark chocolate skin. His mother, Brenda, stood behind the Polaroid as the flash spread across the screen before the scene cut to their South Central Los Angeles front yard. His brother, Darren, was holding him close as he was surrounded by the people who loved him. Trey, Shanice, Chris. They all took turns congratulating him. The camera zoomed in on his gold and burgundy University of Southern California t-shirt. "I'm glad he made it out," Essence said. Serenity stared at the screen as the credits rolled, a heartwarming swell of music building. Tears began to fill her eyes as overwhelming joy squeezed her soul like a swaddling hug. "Dinner," Theresa called in a sing-song voice in the background. Serenity looked over to her mother, who was putting food on the table. She turned her attention back to the screen. A quick burst of static crossed the screen, and Ice Cube's How to Survive in South Central had replaced the inspirational piano swell that came before. Serenity's eyes widened and her mouth held open as the lyrics cut through her like a sickle. Asana touched her arm, bringing her attention back to the room and their waiting meal. "Come eat, TT," Essence said, finally grabbing her sister and pulling her from the couch. When they sat down, their plates were decorated with juicy cheeseburgers with all the fixings, a side of steak fries, and a big sweaty glass of cola on the bamboo coasters to the side. Serenity inspected her oversized cheeseburger. The patty, the gooey cheese, onions, tomatoes, mustard, ketchup, and 2 wet, salty pickles. Her face scrunched up as she pushed her plate away. "I don't like pickles," she said, disgusted. Theresa's smile held strong, but her body language betrayed her. She crossed her arms and dug her long nails into her arms. Essence noticed her bare nails, which were usually covered with some beautiful shade from the rainbow. Today they were raw and dull. "What pickles, TT?" Serenity lifted the bun, inspecting the contents of her burger. Everything she saw before was there except the pickles. She knew there were pickles there. She saw them just as plain as the other layers of flavor, punctuating the burger. "I dash," she started. "We all make mistakes, baby," she said, loosening the grip on her own arms. Serenity smiled at her mother, but she had a sinking feeling. Essence chewed on her burger and dipped a fry in the ketchup puddle on the edge of her plate. She pointed to her mother's hands with the long, soggy French fry. "What happened to your nails, Mommy?" Theresa instantly hid her nails under her arms and closed her eyes, her eyelids fluttering softly. Her lips pressed together tightly and she seemed to speak, but the words came out mute. "I just need a new color," she whispered, sounding extra exhausted. Theresa pushed away from the table and stood, still leaning a little on the heavy table. "I'm not feeling great. I'm going to make some ginger tea and go to bed. Don't stay up too late, girls," she said, before kissing her daughters on the cheek and slowly walking up the stairs. Essence looked at the table where her mother was leaning. She spotted a single strand of hair. When she focused, it was gray, like the one she saw that morning at breakfast. When she leaned back, it looked black again. "I think Mom's sick," Essence said, turning her attention to Serenity. Serenity bounced in her chair, enjoying her pickleless burger. She stared off across the room, nonchalantly. "TT, are you listening?" "She's not sick," Serenity said. "She just needs some rest." Essence pushed away the other half of her dinner and leaned back in her chair. She noticed the maroon runner on the table was gone, replaced by an identical white one. She rubbed her hands across it, feeling the soft, bumpy texture. This was new. She hadn't seen this decoration before. But when she thought about it, she hadn't seen the one from this morning before either. A sudden feeling of fatigue began to overtake the girls as they lay across the couch, watching television. Essence had seen everything Serenity picked on their device. She knew most of the movies word for word. "You should be an actor," Serenity said through a yawn. Essence gave a flat smile and sat up. "Let's go to sleep." She grabbed Serenity and they walked side by side up the stairs and around the corner towards their bedroom. They padded softly across the soft plush carpet, trying not to awaken their mother. But they noticed her door was cracked and her light was on. Essence gently touched the door and pushed it open, planning to tell her mother good night. The light brightened gradually as the opening widened, exposing the queen-size bed situated in the middle of the room. There, Theresa sat on the edge of the bed. She was upright, but her head hung down, her chin buried in her chest. Her hands sat peacefully on each knee. She wore a white cotton pajamas with baby blue stripes and silver snaps holding the top together. When the door opened all the way, Essence expected her mother to react, but she didn't move. Serenity followed closely behind her sister, her hand pressed firmly on her shoulder. Essence stepped gingerly across the carpet, just realizing she had bare feet when she felt the nab of the rug between her toes. She looked over her shoulder at Serenity, now wearing her pink Minnie Mouse nightshirt. Essence kneeled in front of her mother, angling so she could see her face clearly. Theresa's eyes were closed tight. Her face was relaxed. When Essence put a hand on her face, a feeling of uncomfortable peace spread from Theresa through Essence's hand, and then to Serenity, who still kept a hand on Serenity's shoulder. Essence felt waves of contentment drift through her. First a smile followed by soft laughs. She removed her hand, but the feeling remained. Serenity experienced the same pleasant weight inhabit her body. The inordinate gratification gripped her like a vice. The feeling felt forced and not natural, like a flipped switch. Both girls' calming laughter became almost unhinged convulsions crossing the spectrum of emotion. Then came the lightheadedness. A fog descended over them as they lay hopelessly across their mother's bedroom floor. Theresa, suddenly yanked out of her slumbering stupor, opened her eyes. Her eyes were vivid, making the room uncomfortably bright. Her mouth opened wide as if a yell were ripping its way from somewhere unknown. Then a quiet word. "No," she echoed, her voice like a wisp. The room tilted into a swirl behind Theresa as she stood up almost mechanically. She bent down and grabbed both girls by the hands, retaking the misplaced spark the girls held inside. Serenity gasped, flinging her comforter from her body and rolling out of the bed with a clunk. Essence rolled over and saw Serenity on the floor holding her forehead. She rubbed her eyes and glowered at her sister. "What are you doing?" "I had a bad dream," Serenity said, still rubbing her head. Essence sat up and wrapped her comforter around her. She stared at the curtains. They were dark blue, Sailor Moon images dispersed from top to bottom. Essence blinked and turned her attention back to her little sister. "What happened?" Serenity stopped rubbing her head and clapped her hands together in her lap. She pulled her legs together in a crisscross, grabbing her ankles. Her lips curled and twisted as she tried to determine what happened just before she awakened. "I can't remember, but my heart was pounding," she said softly. Essence leaned forward and then closed her eyes. A brief flash of memory brought her to her mother's bedroom. She remembered touching her mother's soft face and then laughing. But that was nonsensical. What's funny about her mother's face? "We gotta get ready for school," Essence said, opening her eyes and standing into a stretch. Serenity got up and walked to the attached bathroom. The room was decorated in a cornflower tile with sparkly gold embossments. The sink, the toilet, and the showers were sparkling white. The room smelled like fresh lavender and clean linens. She looked into the mirror and noticed her braids were in knots like Essence's were the day before. "Thanks for doing my hair, Essie," she yelled from the bathroom. Essence didn't reply. Serenity began brushing her teeth, making sure to reach all the difficult areas and her tongue. She gargled with the mint mouthwash before bending down to spit into the sink. When she raised back up, Essence was standing behind her in the mirror. Serenity gasped. "Hey," she yelped, "what are you doing?" Essence walked slowly over to Serenity and touched her knots. She inspected each of them gently, taking great care not to loosen them. She took a step back and locked eyes with her sister. "I didn't do that," she whispered. Serenity felt a cold spark shoot down her spine, and the tiny hairs on her arms stood at attention. The bedroom door opened with a soft creaking sound announcing Theresa's presence in the room. "Girls," she started, "we've got errands." Essence stepped out of the bathroom, and Serenity poked her head out to see her mother. "I thought we had school," Essence said, almost disappointed. Theresa turned her head to the side slowly. She smiled as she shoved one hand into her pocket and then walked to the dresser. She looked down at the collection of hair accessories, moisturizers, and kids' jewelry. She picked up a pale blue hair bow and rubbed it between her fingers. "Oh no, Essie, there's no school today," she said. Essence looked at her mother's face, feeling something was off. It was clearly her mother, but her usual luminous skin seemed to have declined since the night before. Essence crept closer, getting an up-close inventory of her mother. Her striking, almost yellow eyes had faded into a dull amber. The gray hair she noticed on the dining room table the night before had been replaced by 3 strands, now lucidly making their presence known. Essence was about to point them out before she noticed the rainbow-colored fingernails her mother was sporting. She sighed, releasing a relaxing breath. "Okay, Mommy," she said, wrapping her arms around Theresa. Theresa hugged her tightly, kissing the top of her head. She spoke softly into her hair. "I love you, Essie," she whispered. She looked up and saw Serenity coming closer. She opened up and brought Serenity into the embrace. The tenderness enveloped the 3 of them. "And I love you too, Titi," Theresa said. When Theresa ended the grapple of affection, she stood back and stared at her lovely daughters. She couldn't be more pleased with what God had blessed her to create. All she could think of was keeping them safe and happy. Joyous tears welled in her eyes before one escaped and slid down her cheek. "Get ready," she whispered as she backed out of the room, the door clicking closed behind her with a snap. After what felt like 2 breaths, the girls found themselves in the back seat of Theresa's white sedan. Headed northwest on Breckenridge Lane, Essence and Serenity settled into the back seat, seatbelts strapped snugly across their laps. Essence opened her copy of Too Bright to See before quickly finding her eyes on Serenity's shiny iPhone. Serenity was playing The Sims. One character was making a meal, while another character stood in the nearly empty living room, crying out with loneliness. The glossy, glittery Merlot color of the phone shined as the sunbeams took aim on the inside of the car. "Why did you get a phone anyway?" Essence asked, her thumb rubbing the pages of her book. "Do you ever call anybody?" Serenity didn't reply. Her kitchen sim brought a plate of food into the dining room and left it on the table in front of the lonely sim. With no hesitation, the lonely sim devoured the food and burped obnoxiously. "Gross," Serenity laughed. Essence smiled and stared out the window. She watched the cars around them. They all looked drab and dirty. Even the fancy cars looked like they had been overexposed to the sun. She noticed how in sync the brake lights were. All of the vehicle's lights came on at exactly the same time before they all slowed and eventually stopped in unison. Theresa broke the silence that had engulfed the car. "Oh, this is my favorite song," she said, turning up the volume. Phyllis Hyman's voice glided from the speakers and settled over the vehicle's interior. "I can't stand this living all alone." Theresa sang along, badly, but her passion was evident. She snapped her fingers and swayed as she maneuvered through the traffic. Serenity looked up at her mother and smiled. Essence just stared for a moment at her mother's animation before returning her gaze to the outside of the car. She saw a big furry dog with a long snout staring from the car beside them. The dog's tongue hung out of one side of its mouth, and its floppy ears seemed to sway very slightly with the mild movements of the canine. Essence smiled and waved. The dog blinked slowly but didn't respond to her wave. Over her shoulder she heard a soft squeal from her sister. "A puppy," Serenity gushed. "He's so beautiful. Look at that fur." Theresa stopped singing instantly. She caught her daughters in the rearview mirror, ogling the dog in the car beside them. "We're late," she said softly as she pressed the gas. The girls jerked back into place, their backs flat against the back seat as the car sped up. "But Mom, we were just..." Essence started. "We're here," Theresa said suddenly, cutting off her eldest daughter mid-sentence. The sound of doors opening and slamming blended with the sounds of their butts landing on the hard, cushioned seats of the doctor's office. Theresa signed in while Essence and Serenity sat quietly. Serenity looked at her sister, worry in her eyes. She heard a cough from across the room. She flinched at the thought of being sick. "We never get sick," Essence said, anticipating Serenity's next statement. "Mommy makes sure of it." Serenity watched a man sitting across from them. He wore a derby hat that had seen better days. His dark blue blazer covered his red University of Louisville t-shirt. He stared expressionless in their direction. At first Serenity thought he was looking at them, but they realized there was one of those 3D posters behind them. Essence was still unnerved by his glare, but she decided to stare back defiantly. She found a spot on his face and focused her eyes. The longer she stared, the more comfortable she became. It was like looking at a picture. She stared for so long that she began to wonder if he was breathing. Her mind started racing, but she wouldn't allow herself to fly into a panic. Essence rubbed her hands on her blue jean-covered thigh, and then she closed her eyes, effectively forfeiting the impromptu staring contest. She felt a bump to her side that prompted her to suddenly part her eyelids. Her mother had sat beside her. Stop staring, Essie. It's rude, Theresa remarked. Serenity still looked around. She could feel the sweat under her arms. She clasped her hands together and began to rock slowly. A warm arm wrapped around her and gripped her shoulder. "You good, TT?" Essence asked. "I want to go home," Serenity said softly. A woman walked by pushing a walker. The swishing and scraping that her feet and the tennis balls on the walker felt mismatched to the motion. Essence watched the woman slowly scoot by until she heard her mother's name. "Theresa," yelled the nurse. Theresa tapped Essence on the thigh and then lightly squeezed her. "It won't be long. Take care of your sister," she said, standing up and following the nurse into the back. When the door clicked closed, they sat quietly. Serenity wrapped her arm under Essence's arm and locked it in place, their hands wrapped together. Serenity looked at the seat across from them, and the man in the hat was gone. "He's gone," Serenity whispered. "Maybe they called him back when we weren't looking," Essence said, not believing her own statement. Serenity reached into her pocket and pulled out her iPhone. She tried to turn it on, but the battery was dead. She shoved it back into her pocket. "You have your book?" Serenity asked, staring at Essence. "It's still in the car," she replied, her eyes wandering the room. A door slammed in the distance, echoing through the office and sending a rattling sound that registered in the girl's bones. Essence felt like this was all wrong. She couldn't nail down why she felt this way. The blank stares and the lack of any odor in the room was off-putting. She felt like they were in a room full of empty souls. Yet the waiting room was nearly full. Serenity turned around and looked back towards the 3D painting behind them, but it was now a print of Edvard Munch's The Scream. "That's not the same picture, Essie," Serenity whispered as she tightened her grip on Essence. "Can we go outside?" Serenity asked, her eyes locked into the new picture behind her. Essence looked back at the print behind her and then at Serenity. She squeezed her sister's hand gently. "Yeah, let's go," she said. Essence leaned forward to get up when she heard her mother's voice in her ear. "Where are you going?" Theresa asked. Essence felt her mother's breath on the side of her face, and she turned, surprised, but expecting her mother to be right there. But Theresa was across the room, coming towards them from the exam rooms. Essence's mouth dropped with surprise. She didn't know what to say, and inexplicably, her mother was 30 feet away, when she would have sworn she was right beside her. "Serenity wanted to get some air and get my book from the car," Essence said, forcing a smile. Theresa nodded in agreement. She reached out to take Essence's hand. Essence looked at her hand and saw that 2 of her nails were bare, and the other 3 were still painted. She hesitated for a second, but Theresa wiggled her fingers to coax the grab. Essence took her hand, and the 3 of them walked towards the door. Serenity looked down at the black and white tiled floor. The design of the patterns was satisfying and made her smile on the inside. The slow forming smile on her face faded when she realized that their steps were making no sound on the tiles. "Mommy," she said, looking up at Theresa. Theresa didn't answer. She continued to walk towards the door, her daughters in tow. When they opened the door, the sunlight flashed bright, forcing the girls to cover their eyes as they stepped outside. When the door slammed shut and they uncovered their eyes, they were sitting in the living room at home. Essence's arm was still slowly lowering when she realized she was on the couch. Serenity was sitting on the floor in front of her, staring at her hands. Theresa was sitting in a green corduroy recliner that Essence swore she had never seen before. She stared at her mother, noticing drastic changes in her appearance. She sat on the couch, one leg shoved under her, a bowl of buttery popcorn in her lap. She wore light blue plastic frame glasses. Her hair wasn't in her usual bob. It was pulled back in a French roll. The auburn highlights were replaced by thick streaks of gray and white hair. Her smooth skin was showing signs of aging. A tear hung on Essence's eyelid as she watched her mother, who was focused on the television. "This part always makes me cry," Theresa said, before shoving a few pieces of buttery popcorn into her mouth. She passed the bowl to Serenity, who took it and started eating. Essence turned her attention to the TV. James Evans stood in the middle of an empty living room in the Cabrini Green projects. His wife, Florida, stuck her head into the door. "You coming, James?" "Just a minute, baby." James stood and took a long breath. He looked around the room, and a satisfied smile formed across his lips as he turned and walked out of the door. The studio audience clapped wildly as the theme song began to play in the background. "I love good times," Theresa whispered. Essence looked around the room and noticed a picture on the mantel. She had never seen it before. She crawled over Serenity, who was sprawled out on the floor, and ambled over to the mantel to retrieve the picture. In the picture were two 30-something women. They were wearing their Sunday best. One of them wore a plum-colored, fitted knee-length pencil dress with a matching blazer with shiny gold buttons. Her hair was braided in a low bun. She held a leather purse. The other wore a floral A-line dress with a lavender pastel cardigan. Her hair was in loose curls. She sported pearl earrings and a matching bracelet. A warm, tingling feeling swept over Essence. She smiled at the women, but she felt an anxiety that she couldn't explain. "Mommy, who is this?" she asked. Serenity hopped up and stared at the picture. She mouthed "wow" when she saw them. "They are pretty. Are they sisters?" Theresa smiled and leaned forward to get up. She had to rock a little to gain momentum enough to get out of the chair. Somehow, she looked a little older now than she did just a few moments before. "Mom," Essence said, handing Serenity the picture. She sprinted across the room and reached for Theresa's arm to help her balance. Serenity set the picture on the couch and came over to hold Theresa's other arm. They walked her over to the couch and flanked her on each side. "Mommy, what's wrong?" Serenity asked, rubbing her hands on her mother's now loose skin on her forearm. Theresa looked at Serenity and raised her hand to cup her daughter's cheek gently. "My baby," she whispered as tears began to stripe her face. "I don't understand, Mommy," Essence said, scooting closer and wrapping her arm around Theresa's waist. She was jarred by how frail her mother suddenly felt. Theresa turned to Essence slowly. She gave her a soft, wet kiss on the cheek before leaning back on the couch. Her exhaustion was visible with every small movement. "I tried so hard," Theresa said. "You girls were my life. You are my life." Essence shifted in her seat, turning to face her mother. Serenity slid off the couch and sat on her knees in front of Theresa. "I gave you everything, and I would do it all again," she said. "I raised you the best I could, and then it was all over." Essence looked at Serenity, and their eyes met for a second. "I'm just 14, Mommy. We're not going anywhere," Essence said. Theresa patted Essence on her thigh and gave a weak smile. "You already did," she whispered. "I was just trying to hold on to a little bit of what we had. It was just too much." Serenity felt warm tears build up in her eyes. She put both her hands on Theresa's knees. "What was too much?" Essence asked. Theresa closed her eyes and leaned back. A deep sigh escaped her mouth, emphasizing the fatigue overtaking her. "The doctor said I had to let go. The medicine I just got is supposed to help," she said. Essence's gaze drifted from her mother to the room around them. The glamour was peeling away like old wallpaper. The vibrant walls faded into a pale, worn beige. The 50-inch flat screen shrank and thickened, transforming into the boxy 24-inch tube TV from their childhood. Serenity turned, her eyes widening as the staircase shimmered and vanished. In its place stood the simple, narrow coat closet of the single-story ranch they had grown up in. Theresa's grip on this world was gone. Essence reached for Serenity's hand, lacing her fingers through her sister's. Serenity began to weep, a child's scared, confused cry. Essence wanted to tell her it would be okay, but she couldn't convince herself that it was true. "I just wanted a little more time with my babies," Theresa whispered, her voice sounding like dry leaves skittering on pavement. "I just wanted to hold you." Serenity buried her face in Theresa's lap, her small body jerking with each gasp for air. Essence closed her eyes and leaned in, wrapping her arms around her mother's waist. She pressed a kiss to Theresa's cheek, tasting the salt of real tears. She buried her face in the crook of her mother's neck, inhaling deeply, trying to find Theresa's warm, comforting scent. What hit her instead was iodine, antiseptic, bleach. Essence gasped and opened her eyes. The living room was gone. The warmth was gone. The softness was gone. Cold fluorescent light pressed down on her. Machines surrounded the bed. The rhythmic beeping of the last 3 days had flattened into a single unwavering tone. The chest that Essence had just been clinging to was motionless. Theresa lay still, her skin a muted gray against the white sheets. Essence, now 44, slowly straightened her back. Her joints popped, stiff from hours of standing vigil. She looked down at Serenity, 42, who was slumped in the plastic visitor's chair, her head resting on the edge of the mattress, her hand still clutching Theresa's cold fingers. Essence reached out and gently pried her sister's hand away from the bed, enveloping it in her own. She pulled Serenity up to a stand. Serenity collapsed into her older sister, sobbing into her shoulder. Essence held her tight, just as she had 1,000 times in their childhood. She reached up and smoothed a stray hair from Serenity's face, tucking it tenderly behind her ear. "I've got you," Essence whispered into the silence. She guided Serenity toward the door, neither of them looking back, carrying the memory of a perfect day out into the blinding hallway light. The end. Thank you for walking these streets with me. From Shadows to the Block is a world woven from these lives and desperate moments. None of them exist alone. Every story here echoes into the next. I'll see you in the shadows.